Hi everyone, thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. Today I'm at Redwood National and State Parks, and this morning I sat down with Patrick Taylor and Karla Jovel. We talked all about the redwood trees, wildlife, history in this area, and what visitors can expect when they come to these beautiful parks. Patrick, Karla, it's a pleasure to be with you both. We have this beautiful backdrop behind us just outside of Redwood National and State Parks. What's the high-level overview of what you can find in this beautiful region of Northern California?
Yeah, the main thing, of course, is the redwood trees. That's what everybody knows us for. That's why the majority of visitors initially come here. The forests here are majestic. Everybody falls in love with them. I've never once met a person that came here and was disappointed with the trees. So that's the easy high level why you should come, why you should care. But it gets much deeper, as you can see behind us and around us. There's marine habitats. There's many other trees as well that people start to love. There's oaks. We get a little bit of fall color here. So there's a little bit of something for everybody. There's a lot of cultural history as well, especially with the Tolowa Dee-ni and Yurok peoples. So whether you like history, whether you like the natural world, whether you like peace, whether you like crowds, there's just a little bit of something for everyone here.
And Karla, how about you? What do you find draws you back to this place, and what do you hear from visitors that they find special here?
Yeah, well, Patrick said it really well. I think a lot of people think Redwood National State Parks, they think redwood trees, but this area has so much more to offer. Patrick highlighted the different ecosystems that you can find here, from coastal prairies to oak woodlands to river systems that you really can't find anywhere else in the state of California. But the redwood trees definitely draw in a big crowd from, our local region to our regional to people from all over the world. So I think it's an experience that everybody should have, and that's why people keep coming back.
Here are there state parks and a national park that make up a system of the redwood parks. Can you describe that and what that is like, and what are the 4 parks that make up the Redwood National and State Parks?
Of course, yeah. Well, Redwood National and State Parks was established in 1994, but way before that, in the 1920s, California State Parks initiated 3 state parks here in Northern California, known as Jedediah Smith, Prairie Creek Redwood State Parks, and Del Norte Coast Redwood State Parks. And then for a while, these 2 different agencies were working kind of separately to manage the land here. So doing forest management, wildlife, taking care of riparian environments and watersheds. And I think at some point they decided, well, why are we doing 2 different efforts? Let's work together to maintain these public lands. And that's when Redwood National and State Parks was established.
Yeah, that's great. I think a lot of people think national parks were always first, and state parks in this case were here 50 years before the national park was created in 1968. And in 1978, there was the Redwood Expansion Act, which is a very governmental name for something, but it was really important because it expanded the park, but what it really was the first act in Congress recognizing the ecosystems can't just be like a little photogenic parcel of land that looks really pretty from the side of the road. If you want it to last forever, the whole ecosystem has to be maintained, or the whole watershed needs to be maintained. And that's what the Redwood Expansion Act in 1978 included, was enlarging the national park to include the entire watershed of Redwood Creek, so that the most famous trees are not lost to activities taking place outside the park, just above it, in the watershed further upstream. And then, as Karla mentioned, in the 90s is when it really all came together, and multiple people, partnerships, outside of even the state and federal agencies coming together, realizing if we want everybody to enjoy this, if we want the local economies to really benefit, then we have to think about this holistically and not everybody just worried about their own little piece.
Why did the redwoods need to come under protection? And which park was first in that process that you're mentioning of beginning to protect and rejuvenate these trees and these forests?
Yeah, so again, the state parks were first. It wasn't, the national park didn't come along until 50 years later. The Redwood Expansion Act, though, of 1978, it also did really get into the restoration efforts as well, which is one of the things that administratively sets us apart from most other national parks that focus on preserving. So there's this kind of mentality, I shouldn't say mentality, there's this policy about date of significance. So when most national parks are created, if it was 1923, for example, the idea is let's maintain things as if they were 1923 in perpetuity forever. Let's keep it just like that. When Redwood National Park was created, 2/3 of the land that the park encompassed had already been logged in the previous century and was on an unhealthy path to growing back in, not at its natural rate, not the right tree mixtures. Creeks had been filled in, many roads had been put in place from the logging efforts. And so it was very unhealthy land in those 2/3 of the park. And the Redwood Expansion Act called for restoring the land. And so a lot of the work that takes place now, both in the national and state parks, is not just maintaining the little bit that was already good, but trying to fix what was broken and put it back on the path to success as well.
I think one thing that I'd like to add is that the logging isn't bad, right? We all need logging so that we can build structures, so that we can maintain roads, so that we can use these products to support our everyday lives. But at one point in time, especially during the early 1900s, was when we started to see an overlogging of these redwood trees. So this tree removal resulted in a lot of habitat destruction. It resulted in sedimentation in creeks and streams. And that came to a point where we lost almost about 96% of our old growth redwood forest. So today, only 4% of that old growth redwood forest remains. And so it's really important that in order for us to preserve these incredible, remarkable specimens, that we needed to come in and support by stopping that logging, right?
And in an upcoming episode, we're going to talk a lot more about the restoration efforts here at Redwood National Park. But one thing that I think is really important with these restoration efforts is these redwood trees, it's not like they can just grow anywhere in the world. They need a specific mixture of different things a part of their ecosystem and their environment. Can you talk about that mixture that is needed and why they can only grow in this specific part of the world?
Yeah, I like to refer to it as the redwood recipe. There are certain ingredients that you need to support the growth of a redwood forest. And here in Northern California, we have the perfect environmental and climatic conditions for these redwood trees to survive. One of the factors includes the amount of precipitation that we get here. We get more than about 96 inches of rain on average per year. That's a lot of rain that helps recharges these stream systems as well as the redwood forest. Another reason is the dense fog that we get here during the summer season. Any other time of the year you'll come here, it'll be super wet and it'll be raining throughout the year. But during the summer season, when we don't get that rain, a lot of that water requirement is supplemented by fog. I think it's estimated that about 50% of the water that these trees receive is solely from the fog drip that comes down to the soil and gets soaked up by these redwood trees. Additionally, the temperate climate here, we usually don't see a day over 85 here along the coast. It's nice and cool and temperate, which is the perfect conditions for these redwood trees. They're not under a lot of stress when it stays nice and cool here along the coast.
Yeah, the only little thing I'll add that's fun as a visitor here is if you walk through the redwood forest and you pick up the needles, like little branches with needles on them, it seems like they're coming from different trees, but it's all coming from the redwoods, and they produce different needles at different heights of their growth to capitalize on, like, are these needles collecting the fog, or are these needles collecting the rain moisture? And so you can see how adapted just within one tree it is to make most use of all the different environmental features around it.
I find the redwoods to be so fascinating. And not only is the ecosystem and the environment providing to them, but can you talk about how those redwoods are providing to the ecosystems themselves? I was reading that there's animals that can live in the tree its entire life higher up on it, and the different types of things that the redwood actually provides to these forests.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are ecosystems that literally never see the ground. They're just high up in the trees, up in the canopy their whole lives. It tends to be like insects and amphibians, but there's also bird species like the marbled murrelet and others that tend to roost not just in redwood, but in old growth trees. And they can't nest in the smaller trees and second growth areas. So there are a lot of animals that depend on it. There's often there's the term a mother tree that people reference, and usually what you can find in the old growth is there often is one tree that's just a little bit bigger, a little bit older than all the others around it. And it can be hard to tell when you're walking because they're all really, really big. But if you pay attention, if you measure, sometimes one is just a little bit bigger. And studies over the last decade or so are showing not only do the trees provide habitat for the birds and amphibians and the mammals, but the trees even support each other. So they have networks where they're sending messages and sharing nutrients back and forth. And that's one of the things that's lost sometimes in logging, where there's a mentality of like, well, we can save one or two of the big trees and harvest everything else around it. The big one needs the smaller ones, and the smaller ones need the big one. So if you're just like trophy hunting for the biggest trees, and again, that doesn't happen now, this is more a century ago. But when you take out the big ones, it's removing the support system literally for all the other trees around it. And so like a lot of systems, maybe every ecosystem, everything is very tied to each other and dependent on each other. And you can't just pluck out random pieces of it and expect the whole system to survive and to thrive.
You bring up a great point. The root system on the redwood trees isn't deep. How do they fluctuate in the wind, and how do they support each other to stay standing with something so tall and something so big?
That's a great question that always baffles everybody that comes here, because they're looking at these 300-foot tall redwood trees. And when they find out that their roots only go about maybe 12 feet deep, they kind of scratch their heads and say, well, how does that work? Redwood trees don't grow their roots deep down into the subsoil. They actually grow them laterally to the side. And sometimes they can grow up to 100 feet to the sides. And when they do that, they tend to interlock their roots with other nearby trees, which helps provide that mechanical stability, so that in the case that there is a windstorm along the coast, or if a redwood tree falls, it'll kind of get, pulled back by that redwood tree that's interlocked with the others. So you might find, like Patrick said, a network of trees that maybe over 20 trees that are connected just from the root system. And when they're connected physically, they're also sharing nutrients via mycorrhizal associations on their roots. So it's another way that they interact and connect with each other. And it's not something that we see, but it's happening all the time.
What other things in the forest you alluded to a little bit, but rely on these trees? And are there other ways that these trees get nutrients beyond just water? Is there a specific combination of soil that these trees need to be healthy?
One thing that comes to mind is I really love how these trees not only support themselves with all these amazing adaptations that they have, but support all of the other organisms that live under their understory. Redwood trees are so huge, and they compose about 72% roughly of the forest that they comprise. So they're often referred to as a keystone species, meaning that they impact all of the other species that they're interconnected with. And so because of their height, because of their stature, they kind of create almost like a microclimate in the understory of the redwood forest that helps to regulate moisture, temperature, and really even shade to some degree. So a lot of the species that live under the redwood tree wouldn't be able to survive without them because they rely on those specific characteristics. So that's just something interesting that I wanted to point out.
Yeah, that is interesting. And with this forest, these trees have existed for thousands of years before anthropogenic effects of humans and logging in the area. But one thing that's really unique about these trees is their tannin keeps them healthy and also protects them from fires. Can you talk about that and how resilient they are and what makes them stand out compared to other trees that might be more or less resistant to disease and fires and things of that nature?
Sure, yeah. Redwood trees have an amazing adaptation where they can produce a special chemical compound inside of their heartwood and their bark called tannic acid. And a lot of people wonder, how do these trees get their red color? Well, it's because of the production of that tannic acid. The more tannic acid it produces, the darker, more red, crimson color it gets in its heartwood. And it benefits the trees in so many different ways. One of the benefits that it provides is that these redwood trees become fire resistant because of the tannic acid. So the older these trees get, the more resistant they are to fire regimes or high intensity fires that might come through this area, which is very uncommon. Another reason why these redwood trees are just so cool is the tannic acid that it produces also makes them rot resistant. So even after death, these redwood trees, they fall into the redwood forest. They become what we call a nursery log, where other epiphytic plants are growing on top of them, essentially creating a mini landscape of various native plants. It will take almost 700 years for, I can hear the elk in the background. It'll take almost 700 years for these trees to decay because of that tannic acid. And so not only are they, providing a structure for plants to establish themselves on, but they're also storing a lot of carbon and helping sequester carbon, making it one of the largest carbon sinks in the world. There's not a lot of insects that are known to burrow into these redwood trees, and that's because of their tannic acid. It makes them insect repellent, so they're well protected from any burrowing beetles or other termites that might want to, enter the trees. So it's definitely one of the reasons why these redwood trees have produced such amazing lumber products, because they're fire resistant, they're rot resistant, they're insect repellent. If you were a homeowner, you'd probably want to build your house out of redwood tree, right?
When you come to Redwood National and State Parks, two terms that you'll quickly be introduced to are old growth forest and second growth forest. What are the significance of those two terms?
Yeah, so old growth forests are forests that have been left mostly intact for hundreds or thousands of years. So there's been some human interactions with them, maybe some traditional burning over the centuries, but largely it's a forest that hasn't been logged, is the simplest way to put it. Second growth forests are areas that over the last century were cut, often clear cut, not always, but usually a clear cut area, and then reseeded, very similar to how a farmer would harvest their crop and then plant for the next generation to come in to harvest it again. So the second growth areas were planted largely with the intention to be recut years down the road, but because it came into the national park, or the state park in some cases, it was allowed to just keep growing on its own. And that became a problem because usually you wouldn't plant that many trees in that tight of an area. So now when you go into the second growth forests, to speak from my personal experience, when you walk into them at first you think like, oh, this is a nice forest, there's a lot of trees here. But really quickly you realize like every tree is the exact same age. Every tree is like right up against its neighbor. There's no sunlight coming down to the floor. There's no ferns. There's very rarely very many animals or a lot of animal activity inside of it, because it's almost like a monocrop basically. And so those forests are not healthy for anything, including the trees themselves, because they can't grow at the right rate. Very similar to if you had a generation of people where all you had was like 20-year-olds. Like, it'd probably be fun, but it might be problematic eventually. And so these second growth areas are the areas where we spend a lot of the park's time and energy and resources, is going in and doing treatments on them, which is often thinning. Sometimes it's opening up the streams. Another term we use for it is daylighting. So again, it's so thick in those second growth forests that the sunlight doesn't reach the floor. So by removing some of the trees, that allows the sunlight to come in, which allows different trees to start growing, ferns to start growing, and then the animals, the insects, the birds and everything else can come back into their natural systems.
For people who need more context and everything you just talked about, the Redwood National Park website has some incredible photos that you can kind of slide over, and it shows you the difference between a restored old growth forest versus a second growth forest, and the difference and everything that you're mentioning between the native plants that are on the ground and the biodiversity that exists in those areas. How active is the Park Service in trying to restore those second growth forests back into their traditional old growth forests?
I would say a majority of the park's time is spent on restoration efforts. So if you come here as a visitor and just do the top 5 or 6 hikes, maybe camp for a night, there's a good chance you will never directly interact with the second growth. When the parks were created, they were very much set up for people to come and see the best of the best, which is the old growth. But if you go on some of like the secondary hikes or go a little deeper into the forest, that's where you'll very quickly start interacting with the second growth. Because the redwood ecosystem, when it's left intact, is so healthy, I don't want to say we don't have to do anything for it, but we don't have to do a lot for it. Like, you just kind of stay out of its way and let it run its own course, and it tends to take care of itself. The the work we're doing, it's to benefit everything and everybody, though, in the restorations. It's not just for the tourists to come have a good experience. It's not just for the animals. It's not just for the fish. It's not just for the local economies. But when you put it all together, it's a massive undertaking that benefits even the old growth that's adjacent to a lot of these second growth areas. So the energies we're spending on the second growth restoration projects, which we call Redwood Rising, is to benefit both those lands, but also everything around it.
What other trees exist in these forests, and what other plants can you find in these healthy forests that have been restored?
One that I see very commonly with the redwood trees is our Sitka spruce. Let's see, western hemlocks. You'll see Douglas fir trees. But one of my all-time favorites is probably the big leaf maple. It's not a conifer. It's an angiosperm, but it's got the biggest leaves that you can think of. Definitely bigger than the size of your head. And during this time of the year, during the late fall or early winter, you get to see them changing in color, and they're really striking and really beautiful. So if you ever want to get a chance to see some amazing big leaf maples, I would recommend going down to the Tall Trees Grove in Redwood National Park, where you can see some pretty awesome trees.
And does the redwood have any interplay with the other type of species that are in the forest, or are the fairy rings and the family circles that the redwood trees exist in, is that kind of the only interaction they have with other trees?
There are so many different interactions that different species, tree species, plant species have with redwood trees. Again, redwood trees support a lot of these organisms in different ways. One of the coolest things that comes to my mind is that oftentimes in the redwood forest, you'll see redwood trees that are actually growing other trees inside of them. So you'll find a 40-foot western hemlock growing on a 300-foot tall redwood tree, just like right off a reiteration or a broken branch, growing into the canopy. So I think that's pretty incredible.
That is incredible. How does that tree get its nutrients? Is it from the redwood?
What do you think?
It's got to be from the redwood, right?
Yeah. Well, my question is, how did that tree get all the way up into the canopy, right? But we ask a lot of our students this when they come on our education programs, which is part of our interpretive initiative here in this park, is to bring students into these park settings and get them to connect with the old growth redwood forest and all of its associated ecosystems. The kids get it right away. A bird picks up a seed, takes it to the top of the canopy, drops that seed, and then the tree will grow from there. So next time you're walking through a redwood forest, make sure you're looking up. It's really hard to look down, not to look down when you're walking through the redwood forest, because all those redwood roots are coming at you. You don't want to take a misstep, but if you look up, you'll find a lot of incredible things up in the canopy.
One redwood tree that's talked a lot about for visitors that come here and that don't come here is Hyperion. But there's strict rules regarding visitation to the Hyperion tree, which is the tallest tree in the world. Can you talk about Hyperion, the tree, and why there's strict rules regarding visitation of that tree?
Yeah, Hyperion is our current record holder. It's over 380 feet tall, tallest tree in the world, very popular tree for people to talk about and be interested in, and it's amazing. In a lot of ways, it's a lot like all of our other really tall redwood trees, though. In fact, over the years of the park's existence, multiple times there's been the world's tallest tree, only to discover a new one a little bit later on that's slightly taller. Or maybe the current record holder, gets hit by lightning and the crown, the top 50 feet of it is lost or something. So it's a little bit of a chasing game when we talk about what's the tallest tree in the world, because we all recognize it will change at some point, and whether that's a year from now or a decade from now, we don't know. But currently it's Hyperion. It is in a particularly challenging area to get to. And so in the early days of the park's creation, lots of times the tallest trees would have trails constructed to them. And lots of times the trails are fairly destructive to the environment you're going through. I think over the years we've learned to make them a little better, a little more conscientious of how to keep the ecosystem intact and not segment things. But again, it's a chasing game. So do we build a new trail every time there's a new tallest tree? Regardless of what that means we destroy to get there. And the decision was made a while ago, no, we won't. We're not going to constantly be building new trails just to get to whatever the tallest tree of the day or the year is. And so Hyperion, like a lot of areas of the park, are protected, and we limit how many people get there and how they can move around it in order to protect not just that tallest tree, but really get into the system around it. Lots of times we focus on the tallest because it's very iconic. It's also not a very photogenic tree. If you do go there, it's got so many other big trees around it, and it's on a slope that you don't get a single shot of it. So if people wanted to get a cool picture of a redwood tree, Hyperion is not the one you'd want, even in like your top 100 probably. So it's very important, and it's a representation of how tall the trees can get. A lot of the science says they can get taller than that, so we might still find another one later on, or another one is probably slowly catching up to it as we speak. But again, one of the terms we often use is we're in the forever business. And so what we want to do is protect the old growth redwood forest forever. And so we're always looking at holistically, how do we make sure the whole system is intact and functioning?
And what are some of the things that you see in the park from visitors when they're just going out and exploring, whether it's innocent or anything like that, that you find destructive to the forest? Is it going off trail? Is there a problem with people, putting their name on a tree trunk? What are some of the things that you see in the park from visitors that can be destructive to these old growth forests?
Yeah, and this is a little bit of a confession box because I'll admit some of my sins the first time coming here as well. So when we came here, a decade and a half ago, the first time with our kids when they were little, we would tell them, go get right up next to that tree so we can take a picture of it. So they would, stand 2 inches off the trunk. And a lot of the fallen old growths and some of the groves, like Stout Grove, the kids can run along for 200 feet. So we'd say, like, hop up there. And they'd, run kind of parallel to the trail for 200 feet. It was an amazing experience. And then later, as we learned more, what we realized is we're essentially killing maybe a little bit the tree that's growing if you're getting too close to it and like stripping away that foundation or insulation it has at its base. But in particular, when you're running along those trees that have fallen, you're taking out the next generation of trees. So when you can find those nursing logs that have fallen and nobody has walked on them, you can see those 40-foot trees are coming out of them. And when you walk along the top, it strips that away. So again, you're slowly eating away at basically the next generation. It's being receiving its nutrients from the fallen trees. We also do have graffiti, people going off trail. There's a little bit of everything that goes on in the park, but I would say the two most common issues that are usually just lack of education issues are people trying to stand right at the base of the tree for their photograph or walking along the nurse logs.
What are some of the top attractions, if you will, when people come here? What you mentioned it earlier. There's protected coastline. There's some incredible hikes. What are those hikes that visitors kind of seek when they come to this area?
Yeah, well, if you're thinking you want to see some really big old trees, I would highly recommend doing any of the hikes at Prairie Creek Redwood State Park. Prairie Creek Redwood State Parks is the second largest contiguous portion of old growth redwood forest that remains in the world. So there's lots of opportunity there to go explore some really amazing trees. If you're looking to do maybe like a short walk, start at the visitor center and do the Carl Knapp Trail to the Foothill Trail. There you'll see an amazing representation of old growth redwood conditions, and you might even get to see some Roosevelt elk along the way. They like to hang out in front of the visitor center and pop into the trails every so often, so just keep an eye out if you are going to take that trail. But if you're looking for an adventure, I would recommend the James Irvine Trail. That one goes right through the heart of the old growth at Prairie Creek and then ends out on Gold Bluffs Beach, which is a beautiful coastal strand that you can also visit places like Fern Canyon. So I would highly recommend that hike as well.
One thing I'd also recommend when people are planning here is they really use our websites and our app. So one of the things I've noticed with the public is they get very fixated on the name of things. So we have like a tree that's called Big Tree. We have a grove called the Tall Trees Grove. And those are amazing, but they're also very similar to almost every other old growth walk you can do in the park. So lots of times people get over fixated on the name of thing and they think like, oh, if I don't go to Big Tree, my trip's a disaster. When there's many other spots you can go to that are just as good. In fact, I think Karla and I, a lot of what our job is and the staff we work with is to make people's trip successful. And so we spend a lot of time developing apps and handouts and having staff work at visitor centers and leading programs so that you can go interact either digitally or in person with us or our staff. And in 5 minutes, you can say, this is what I'm looking for. And somebody can kind of give back to you, like, here's how that trip will be successful. Don't worry about on the map, that one says Big Tree. Like, that's not the end all be all, even though it is an amazing tree.
What's your favorite place in the park?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the very first time I came here with my family, we were on a longer vacation that was a massive disaster in many ways. Things kept going wrong. There were like wildfires in the other spots we went to. We drove down to the coast, and actually the first spot we went to is the beach right behind us. And so my favorite spot is Crescent Beach that's back behind us. It doesn't have a single redwood tree anywhere right around it. And so it's kind of a weird thing to tell people, but it's just that personal connection I have to it. We got out of the smoke. We got out of the mosquitoes. Our kids were having fun running along the beach. There was incredible fog rolling off the ocean that day, and we lived in the desert at the time, so that was a very enjoyable experience. So that is, like, in my heart, my favorite spot to be. When visitors come to us, though, like if we have family come and they say, where should we go? We usually go to Stout Grove. So that's at the northern end of Redwood National State Parks in the Jedediah Smith area. And it's one of the more famous trails, but it has a lot of the old growth. You can get right next to the Smith River, see California's only undammed river. So it has a lot of really incredible resources to see in a relatively short and easy hike.
Karla, you had mentioned the Roosevelt elk, which I find fascinating. There's only a couple places that you can find the Roosevelt elk. What makes the Roosevelt elk unique from, maybe a traditional elk you can find elsewhere in the United States?
Yeah. Well, the Roosevelt elk here are just super incredible because they have an amazing comeback story. At one point in time, there was less than 100 elk left throughout all of California, and that's due to overhunting. That stemmed mostly in the early 1900s, but luckily, thanks to a lot of land managers, the elk here have made a comeback. And now there are over 1,000 elk living in Northern California. So the Roosevelt elk are the largest land mammal in all of Northern California. The males could be up to about 1,200 pounds, which is just insane if you think about it, which just a plug for all of our visitors out there, if you do see elk, make sure to keep your distance because they are wild animals and they need their space. The other thing I wanted to mention is their antlers are just so striking. The males will grow their antlers and drop their antlers every single year. So it's pretty incredible to kind of watch their cycles from a distance every single season. So that's probably what I'd say is my favorite parts about the Roosevelt elk.
Well, I think this podcast and really this park is the story of comebacks. We talk about the redwood tree and the restoration. You just mentioned the Roosevelt elk. One other amazing, amazing comeback story here is the California condor. And I don't want to spoil all the topics in an upcoming show. We're going to talk more about the condor. But what does it mean to this area to have the condor return through restoration efforts and reintroduction efforts from Redwood National Park?
Yeah, a lot of what I've talked about is looking at things holistically as a system, and the condors were one of the major species that's been gone for almost a century in this area. They're kind of natural food disposal systems to help keep the ecosystem clean and healthy and functional for everything else. And bringing them back to the area was a really, really big initiative. I know when I first heard about it about a decade ago, it kind of intellectually confused me. I was like, there's no way condors can fly through redwood forest or any forest. Like, they need wide open desert country, because that's just in my head what I've learned. But I think that kind of shows the lack of education I had in understanding even the environment where we are here. We always fixate on the forest, but within the park, if you go a little higher in elevation, you get to big meadows and kind of scrubby oakland. There's all the beaches, and the condors were an essential part of keeping all that functioning. And the initiative to bring them back is many, many years in the making. There's many different partners involved with it. So the parks were just one, I don't want to say small, but one piece of the pie. The Yurok tribe is a major partner in it. The Fish and Wildlife Service is a major partner. And it took a lot of people and different places that had already experienced success with the restoration of the condors to bring them back. And one of the things that was really rewarding for me when I got here just after condors had been released was learning not just the kind of natural role that condors play, but hearing from the tribes about how much of it was like bringing back a lost member of the family that had been gone for generations, that really it was restoring a missing piece of the cultural history, not just the natural history.
And I think that's what makes this place so special, is you hear that story with the redwood trees and a lot of this area, which is really incredible. There's such cultural significance to people who have been here since time immemorial, which is really, really unique and special. What other animals can visitors see when they come here? I know you have the coastline, so what's kind of some maybe common marine life that you can see off the coast?
Yeah, again, harkening back to my very first experience here, we went out to Crescent Beach, and if you walk down towards the end of it, there's an area called Endert's Beach, and if you go down there, it's great. There's amazing tide pools here, and so it's not the big, huge, like, mega fauna that people are always after necessarily, but tide pooling is an amazing experience, especially for people that aren't used to the coast, seeing sea stars and everything else that you can literally just reach down and gently touch and kind of experience is pretty incredible. And especially if you come here with kids, when kids have those like tactile experiences, you can just see like hearts and minds changing a little bit as they interact with the natural world rather than just seeing photos or videos of it. So along the coast, that's probably the biggest draw. There is the chance to see like seals and whales, but a lot of those are a little more observed from farther away or areas just outside of the park. So we have some overlooks that different times of the year you can see the whales cruising by. Some of the communities just to the north of Redwood National State Parks, you can stop and get a bite to eat and see a lot of the marine life that's hanging out right there on the pier next to you. We do have a lot of the more charismatic, bigger animals. So we've talked about the elk, we have black bear, we have mountain lions. Those aren't very common. In fact, a lot of visitors are kind of scared to go out and that they might run into them, but the odds are overwhelming. You won't see them, hear them, or really have any awareness of them, but they're still here playing their natural role in how the system operates here. And on one of my hikes in the park, we could hear a mountain lion kind of like crying out in the distance. And there was a little flash of terror in all of us, but it was also this like, how lucky are we? We knew stay together, stay as a group. They're not hunting us. And so it was an incredible moment to hear like the full, what nature really can be in these areas.
Even just sitting here listening to the elk, make their noise and walk around us is special too as we have a conversation. You mentioned mountain lions and black bears, though uncommon. Would a bear spray be permitted in this area? Obviously, if it's uncommon and it's a black bear, not a grizzly bear, probably not likely you'd ever need to use it, but are you allowed to carry it with you on a hike here?
You're actually not. Bear spray is not, it's not legal to carry bear spray here. And I think it might stem to the fact that bears are such a non-issue here. Our bears are typically considered good bears because they're not the kind of bears that'll break into your car and steal your food. Don't quote me on that, but so far it's been good so far. It's really, I think, what I'm trying to say is I think it's really a response to how well our visitors behave when they're in our parks, putting their trash in trash receptacles, putting their food away in their bear boxes when they're camping in our campgrounds is really helping the protection of this wildlife in the long term, I think.
Black bears are really known to be tremendous climbers. Do they climb redwood trees, or do they have a preference of tree that they interact with, I guess, in these forests?
I know black bears climb trees. I've seen one black bear in a Douglas fir tree here before. I've never seen one in a redwood, but I know rangers who have seen them in redwood trees. They've gotten videos of them, and I'm very jealous.
I'm sure this is paradise for black bears then.
We have the highest density of black bears in all of Northern California here. So They're very common, commonly spotted in deeper parts of the forest. But, it's a good thing that we don't see them every day because we want them to stay wild.
What do you find personally special about being here in these forests? And when you find solitude in these forests, how do you connect with these redwood trees?
That's a really loaded question. I personally love to go on walks on my own, and I always have my camera with me. So I know I'll never be able to capture the beauty and, the size of these trees in a photo that I take, but it doesn't hurt to try. So I do a lot of nature journaling when I'm out in the redwood forest as well. I try to capture the little things that by now should seem mundane to me, but I can't seem to, not find it spectacular. There's just so much to experience. If you look down in the redwood forest floor, you'll find a cosmo of a ecosystem just in 1 square foot. So just take a closer look at the little small details of the redwood forest, and you'd be really surprised at what you can find.
Patrick?
Yeah. So a visitor once told me an experience they had here, and I feel like it kind of sums up what I think about the parks. They said they'd come on a long road trip and they had a car full of really rambunctious, rowdy teenagers that were just ready to explode the moment they got out of the car because they'd all been cramped up. And so they got out, they started on a hike down an old growth trail, and about 2 minutes into it, the chaperone with these kids said, "Hey, how come you're all whispering?" Because all of the kids were, despite all the energy they had, they were kind of talking to each other in these very almost like reverential voices, very calm and collected and just kind of like absorbing more than emitting, I guess. And I feel like that's a very common experience that a lot of us have here is we know the trees are going to be tall. Like everything you read about is these trees are going to be tall, but almost none of us have any real life experiences that can prepare you for what it's like to get out and walk through it. And even if you're not necessarily like a religious person, the traditional sense of it, there's something about these trees and the system when you walk into it, just like the silence and like the slowness and the steadiness of it that just like kind of touches everybody in their heart, even if they know what they think they're expecting. And seeing people get that is what I enjoy the most. And so lots of times, it's really easy in any job to get kind of caught up in like the daily administration of your job, but we're very fortunate in what we do that we literally get to live and work in a bucket list destination for a lot of people. And when you get to see that like flash of this is better than I thought it was going to be, or oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm really here, that's the most rewarding part for me of being here.
We talked a little bit about the weather here, but how does the weather change in this area, and when is visitation high? When does it start to get calmer here, and how does weather play a role in that?
Yeah, so the weather doesn't change as dramatically here as many other places. The temperature variation is maybe 20 degrees from summer to winter. It's really just, is it wet or is it not wet? That's the big changes throughout the years. Of course, over the winter, we get a lot of the rain. In the summer months, it is surprisingly dry. I thought it would kind of rain throughout the year, but you can go 2 or 3 months where there's not a drop of rain that falls. So it is very dry from the atmosphere. But as Karla mentioned earlier, the forest kind of acts like its own greenhouse to some degree. So even if you walk into the old growth in the middle of summer, you can still feel that high humidity. But that's part of the reason we have the old growth here again, is because the weather is so consistent for them that they can get the moisture throughout the year in different ways. And it also makes the park a really nice place to visit. Again, if anybody that's looking out behind us right now, you probably wouldn't associate this weather for November, but here we are in December now already. And so it's always a good time to visit the park. One of my wife's favorite sayings when our kids want to go out on hikes is, there's no such thing as bad weather, there's just bad preparation. So really, other than windstorms, you can go out and enjoy the forest just about any day of the year here.
And you touched on this in your last answer, but how important is context when you come to this park and understanding what these trees have gone through for thousands of years, from logging to various different things, and the people who have interacted with these trees for thousands of years. And these trees mean a lot to a lot of people. How important is it to know that context and that history than just coming to these parks and just realizing that these are really tall trees? Does the context of the historical significance of these trees in this area add a lot to the experience?
I think it does. Redwood trees have sustained communities for thousands of years, since time immemorial, like you mentioned, when we're thinking about, tribes such as Yurok or Tolowa, Tallulah. There's so many people that have depended on these trees for so long. But in addition to that, all of the wildlife that they sustain, all of the plants that they support, these redwood trees are almost larger than life in some way, and it's really hard to describe. And especially when you're standing in front of them, it's just really kind of hard to put into words, really, how big these trees really are.
Yeah, one of the things I hear visitors say sometimes is like, oh, we're so lucky to see these trees. And there's part of me that wants to be like, luck had nothing to do with you seeing these trees. It was the dedicated effort of like a few small people and groups a century ago that let us have these trees here. So the indigenous groups for thousands of years helped maintain this landscape, and they were an active part of traditional burns and other things that kept the system functioning properly. And then over the course of like 20, 30 years, we almost lost the entire old growth system from Oregon all the way down to the Bay Area. But again, it was almost a handful of very dedicated individuals, some local women's gardening groups, a couple wealthy people, some traditional advocates that really stepped in and sacrificed to themselves their times. And that's why these forests are here. And so, yeah, anybody can drive down the side of the road and just pull over and be like, this is amazing, and take a picture of it as a commodity. And that's fine. I think that's kind of the entry point for almost all of us, is you just see it as something cool and impressive, or, you know, something you want to put in your social media feed. And that's a great entry point, but I think you appreciate it more when you understand the role the trees have played traditionally and the role people have played historically and now, and making sure that that's still an experience we can have.
As we wrap this up, I want to give you both a chance to say one final piece on what Redwood means to you, or, you know, final piece of encouragement to encourage people to come out and explore these beautiful trees and this beautiful place.
Thanks. I just hope that the folks listening to this podcast, if they haven't already, that they come experience Redwood National State Parks, not just for the redwood trees, but for all of the other factors that we had described with our time together today. I'm a strong believer that parks are for everybody. You know, no matter what your culture, your background, your identity is, you deserve to be in parks, and they should always be a safe and welcoming place for everybody. So make your way out here. Hopefully we'll see you soon. Drop by the visitor center and connect with one of our amazing rangers or interpreters to find out what trail to take, to find out where to see the Roosevelt elk. And we are going to be more than happy to help you plan your vacation and experience the Redwoods.
Yeah, the two words I've already said a lot, but always come up for me, are community and restoration. That's what these parks are all about. It wouldn't be here if it wasn't for those two. A lot of people and family that I talk to far away, they say, oh, you're so inconvenient where you are. You know, there's no major airports. The interstate isn't right next to us. But the other side of that equation is like, that's probably why these trees are still here, because it was inconvenient. And that's what makes it kind of worth it, is the investment and energy you have to do to get up here. But when you come, again, as Karla was mentioning, make sure you take in the entire community, whether that's the people around you, the people that live here, the businesses, you know, the preservationists a century ago. Make sure you understand that whole story. And when you come here, it'll bring you closer to the people that you're with. It's just such an intense, almost emotional experience that whether you do a long backpacking trip or you just go to a forest for an hour, it'll bring you closer to the community that you travel with.
Patrick, Karla, thanks so much. This has been a blast, and I think you live in a very beautiful area. I'm very jealous. I'm very excited to explore over the next couple of days.
Agreed. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. Patrick and Karla are great advocates for this area, and I really hope you get the chance to come check out this beautiful place. So if you like this type of content, it would mean a lot to me if you liked, commented, and subscribed. And until next time, safe travels.